Let me first start by saying there will be no real names or locations given in this, because it would be illegal for me to do so. It's illegal to discuss a case you're a juror on outside of the courtroom, much less post about it on a public internet forum. Now that that's out of the way, let's get to it. I was called for jury duty, which began about 2 weeks ago. I went to the courthouse, had my interview conducted, and a few days later got a call saying I'd been selected. The trial started this past Wednesday. What's more is that strange things have been happening not only to me, but to a few of the other jurors as well since the trial started. The case. On trial is a man named John Willis. He is charged with the brutal murder of his wife and sister. John is 32 years old, graduated from Penn State University, and moved to our city for a job as an environmental engineer. This doesn't sound too strange when said out loud, but as they say, the devil is in the details. I can only describe the photos of the crime scene, as I obviously don't have copies of them myself. Crime scene photo number 1. The first photo is easily the most gruesome of the 3 they have printed large and on display. It depicts John's sister Erica. She is horribly battered and bloody. What stands out about the photo, though, is where she is. In a hallway of John Willis's house, where the crimes took place, it looks as if someone tore out all the drywall from one wall. Then, the wood slats that make up the frame of the wall have all been snapped in 2 places, one at the tip to give it a jagged edge, and once near the middle, bringing that jagged edge down 90 degrees. It's basically a spike wall. Erica is impaled on these broken slats about 2 feet off the floor, so high that her slumped over head would be hitting the ceiling if it were upright. It's incredibly disturbing to look at. Crime scene photo number 2. This photo depicts his late wife, Jessica. Kind of. What happened to Jessica might actually be worse than Erica, all things considered. Jessica's body is folded up in a suitcase. A small suitcase. The kind that's about as big as you can have while still calling it a carry-on on a flight. From what I can tell, all of her bones had been broken away from the joints, meaning they were manually snapped in half with force. Her fingers, toes, arms, legs, ribs, everything was broken, without breaking the skin. She was folded in such a way that the bottom of her mangled feet were flush with her ears, and her arms were bent backwards at the elbow, so her palms were flat on her shoulder blades underneath the rest of her body. It's absolutely sickening to look at. Crime scene photo number 3. The last display was actually more of an array. It showed the house in the condition it was in after the bodies had been removed. Evidence markers littered the floors and walls, but what was most evident was some kind of substance. I can't really describe it. It was like chalk dust, but black. Pure black. It was all over a bunch of the house, inside and out. They haven't yet revealed to the court what it is. The array of photos basically shows the bloody house, the hallway that was home to the closed doors of 2 bedrooms and a home office, an opened and a closed bathroom, and 2 attic openings. Upon the revealing of this photo array, I distinctly remembered John's eyes getting wide with concern, and him whispering to his attorney. The defendant, John Willis. As I said, John Willis is a 32-year-old male, a graduate from Pennsylvania State University, and an environmental engineer. He's a small man, I'd say about 5'8", maybe 130 pounds. He doesn't look to me as anyone who has ever been accused of being intimidating. He was born here and went to Pennsylvania for school. He then moved from Pennsylvania back to this area when he was 24 years old for his master's degree, and met his wife a very short time after. They married 8 months after meeting. He had always been very close with his sister, especially after their father passed when he turned 20, and their mom passed away from cancer when they were young. The years following their deaths saw them grow much closer than ever before. He let Erica live with him and his wife for the first year of their marriage. By that point, she was financially stable enough to get a place of her own again. By all accounts, John seems like a relatively timid person. He had never been charged with a crime before this, and his only run-ins with the law were 2 citations, one for parking and the other for speeding. It started off like any other court case. Both the defense and the prosecution gave their opening statements, blah blah blah. Then, a complete overview of the events that led to the discovery of the bodies was presented. The night of the crime. Around 8:30 p.m., John Willis called the police and informed them that his sister was dead and his wife was missing. They played the 911 call, and in it, John sounded seriously distressed. The problem was, John said he was home the whole time, sitting in his office working. He didn't hear any kind of disturbance. He claims he got up to go to the bathroom, and that's when he found his sister impaled in the hallway. Police showed up, and after clearing everyone out of the scene, the detectives went around the house looking for anything noteworthy, and came across a suitcase that was zipped all the way except for a very small portion at the end of the zipper. Inside the suitcase, they found the grotesquely folded up body of Jessica Willis. After finding no evidence of a break-in, and nothing pointing to any outside party being involved, they placed John under arrest. At this point, we were let out for the day, but that night, strange things began happening. The first night. I got to my house around 7:30 p.m. As soon as I stepped foot out of my car, I felt a strange feeling, the ever so common scary story trope of being watched. I looked around, but I saw nothing. I went inside and I was going to make some dinner when all of my lights flickered. After a few seconds of flickering, they all went out. But even the light from outside went away. It was like I went blind. I fumbled around trying to find my phone to call 911 as I thought something was wrong with me. Suddenly, the light flooded back into my eyes. It was almost blinding in the reverse way as it had just been. When my eyes adjusted, everything was normal again. The only thing different about my house was that there was black chalk dust all over my dining room table. I went back to the courthouse the next day, and on the faces of a few of the other jurors, there were looks of fear and confusion. There was a woman there, Jackie, who looked particularly disheveled. I asked her if she was okay, and she told me what had happened to her the night before. Jackie's first night. Jackie was in bed, almost asleep, when she heard her bedroom door creak open. Assuming it was her cat, she ignored the sound. Then, she heard that same door creak closed. She shot up in bed and peered over at her door. She felt that something was in the room with her, but couldn't see anything. Her cat wasn't in her room, and she lives alone. Then she heard breathing. Deep, guttural breathing, but like it was attempting to mask its sound. She was curled up in her bed, more afraid than she'd ever been. She felt the covers get tugged down from the foot of the bed. She closed her eyes and prepared for the worst. She said that after what seemed like an eternity, she heard her door creak open again. She opened her eyes and the feeling of company was gone. Her covers were pulled almost to the end of her bed. She stayed awake, sitting up until morning, and when she got up, she saw on her doorknob that there was a black dust similar to the stuff in the crime scene photos, as she put it. Court that day was postponed until Monday for reasons unbeknownst to us. Nothing has happened to me today so far, but it's getting dark now, so we'll see. I'll report more after court on Monday. Part 2. So, after I posted the last one, I've gotten a few people freaking out about the fact that I'm on a jury and posting about it online. The fact is, I'm not looking for opinions on the case. I am impartial when it comes to the trial of John Willis. All that information is just background. What's really concerning me and causing me to post this are the things happening outside of the courtroom since this trial started. So please, if you have a moral objection to what I'm doing, keep it to yourself. Also, the Willis case is happening in a relatively small town, and it's not getting any mainstream coverage. Hell, it's barely getting any local coverage, so yeah, let's get to it. I had to go out to the store Saturday afternoon, and when I opened my car door, I had that black dust stuff on my hands, like it was underneath my car door handle. I still had, and still have, no idea, as of the writing of this post, what it is. Anyways, on my way to the store, I heard something shuffling around in my back seat. It freaked the shit out of me, naturally, but I was driving on the freeway, so I couldn't exactly pull over and stop just then. I looked in my rear view and saw nothing. Just to be sure, I quickly looked behind me, and I'm not really sure what I saw. There was something like hiding under a black cloak. I let out a yell, and when I looked forward, I almost rear-ended the car in front of me. I collected myself and looked back again, and all that was there was a bunch of that black dust. I made it to the store and back with no further problems, although I did check my back seat about every 10 seconds on the way back from the store. I got home and unlocked my front door, again getting black dust on my hands. I of course figured that this must mean that whatever was going on was either happening in my house currently, or it was from what happened the night before. I got in my house and nothing seemed strange. I went about the rest of my day. Nothing happened until night came. I was sitting in the living room on my laptop and I felt a breeze. It was an extremely cold breeze though, like I had just opened a walk-in freezer, but even colder than that. I hadn't opened any windows because it's February, and I know I didn't have my air conditioning on, again, because it's February. I got up to see where the draft was coming from. I walked down my hallway and saw that the window in the bathroom was open. There was, of course, black dust on the windowsill. I figured this meant that something was about to happen. I went back and sat on the couch, ignoring my computer and focusing completely on the room in front of me. I stayed there, on high alert, until I fell asleep. When I woke up Sunday morning, still sitting up on the couch, I felt like something was different, but I couldn't quite place it. I got up and cautiously walked throughout my house, trying to find something that was out of the ordinary. I couldn't find anything, but I just had the overwhelming feeling that something had been done. Most of Sunday went by okay, but then the sun set. Right at dusk, I heard a banging coming from my attic. Now, I'm the kind of person that will do everything I can to justify something before beginning to look for answers in the paranormal or supernatural. I reasoned that it was some kind of animal that had gotten into my attic somehow. I heard scurrying all around above me, like a squirrel running back and forth. Then suddenly, a loud boom came from the area right above me. Then I heard sliding, like someone was dragging their very large feet across the attic floor. I called the police because I'm not stupid, and they came to check out my attic, which, of course, was empty. They did ask me what the black dust all over the floor in my attic was, to which I obviously had no answer. The police left, and both of the officers gave me their cards in case I had any further problems. At about 11 p.m., shortly after the police left, I heard a crash and something slide in my hallway. Before even looking, I knew that it was the drop ladder to my attic. Something had either pulled it down from below or pushed it down from above. Or, I thought, the police hadn't locked it in place when they exited the attic, so it had fallen. I walked towards the fallen ladder and suddenly, as if someone had flipped a switch, an extremely bright light shone from the attic into the hallway. I stopped dead in my tracks and waited for something else to happen. The light seemed to get brighter and brighter until it was almost pure white, to the point that it was hurting my eyes. Then, as quickly as it had started, it stopped with what sounded like the light bulb in the attic exploding. I heard that familiar sliding sound go from the door to the other side of the attic above me. I ran and shut the drop ladder and made sure the lock was properly set. And that was the last issue I had on Sunday. Today, I reported for court at 9 a.m. Today was the day for witness testimony and cross-examination. Witness for the defense number 1, Rebecca Damone. Rebecca Damone is John's next-door neighbor. Her initial statement was gathered during canvassing of the area, which she reiterated for the court. She mentioned that she was in her backyard doing some gardening before it got too dark, and that at one point around 7:45, John walked into his backyard, where they exchanged a wave, and he walked back into his house without doing anything outside. Shortly after that, she heard one scream, and one scream only. She said it was a short yelp, not like someone was getting hurt, but like someone had jumped around the corner and scared them. During cross-examination, the prosecution asked her if she was sure that what she had heard was in fact a scream, if it was so short of an instance. She said yes, and that it absolutely came from the Willis' house. The defense then asked Rebecca to disclose her relationship with John, if any, and what she thought of him as a neighbor. Rebecca said that they'd been neighbors since he'd moved into the house next to her, and that he always seemed like a friendly man. He and his wife introduced themselves upon moving next door to her, and she said that they always looked seemingly happy. She did say that one night a few weeks before the murder, John came to her house and asked her if she'd heard anything in her attic lately. When she said no, he just stood there staring into her house until she closed the door. That was the only issue she'd ever had with him, and said she would regard him as a fine neighbor. Witness for the defense number 2, James Bradley. The extent of James Bradley's testimony was the information that John had called him multiple times regarding strange things going on in his home, feelings that he was being watched, things out of place, something paranormal. The prosecution basically just grilled him on being a quote-unquote paranormal expert, and essentially tried to paint the whole profession as a joke. Witness for the prosecution number 1, Amanda Clement. Amanda was a friend of John's sister, Erica. She informed the court that she had recently been proposed to, and was considering moving out of the state, as her now-fiancé's new job was transferring him. She had been with Amanda getting coffee just before she went to John's house, and was ultimately murdered. Her plan was to tell John the news. Witness for the prosecution number 2, Anthony Mineo. Anthony Tony Mineo was quite the witness the prosecution brought forth. He was, apparently, the paramour of Jessica Willis, as they had been carrying on a clandestine relationship for nearly 2 years. In Tony's opinion, John had found out about it and murdered her. The prosecution corroborated this by presenting text messages from the day before the murder, in which Jessica discussed the fact that her husband might know about their affair. It was all pretty damning evidence. The defense cross-examined Anthony, and in all honesty, kinda made fools of themselves. They basically just had him restate what he'd already said, and then sorta just flat out asked him why the court should believe he himself didn't do it, as if he were some scorned lover who couldn't get over the fact that she wouldn't leave her husband, even though there was no basis for such an insinuation. That's when I noticed the defense attorney acting strange. He was like mildly twitching every few seconds, and had a look of fear in his eyes I'd never seen on a person before. Now that I think about it, he kinda looked like that the entire day, and at the time, this made me think of Jackie. I looked over to her, and she was 2 seats away from me, and I immediately noticed bags under her eyes. I looked at the others, and about half of my fellow jurors looked as if they hadn't slept since the trial began. When we were excused for the day earlier, around 3 p.m., I gathered the ones that had looked particularly disheveled, and we all stepped into the room that held the vending machines, and we discussed our individual problems. Here are the few that really stood out to me. Juror number 3, Mike Forsyth. Mike was sleeping in bed with his wife and woke up when he heard loud, exaggerated breathing. He turned over and saw that his wife was sound asleep and that the breathing wasn't coming from her. Then he got worried, hoping that it wasn't their dog. He got up to look at the foot of the bed where their dog slept every night. As he was sitting up, he stopped when he saw someone standing in the corner. They were facing him, but in the dark he couldn't make anything out. He said whoever it was very tall, looking as if he was wearing a cloak. The person in the corner then slowly dropped to their knees and began crawling towards the bed. Mike jumped up out of bed and turned on the bedroom light and saw no one there, only a black dust streak where the thing had been crawling. He called the police, who came and took his statement and looked around. His wife said she hadn't seen or heard anything and was convinced her husband was just dreaming, although she was unable to explain the black dust on the floor. Juror number 11, Trinette Bryant. Trinette lives at home with her 2 sons, with a boyfriend who is a truck driver, so he's not home most nights. On Friday night, her 2 sons ran to her in the middle of the night. They share a room, saying that someone had crawled out of their closet and into the living room. Trinette said she got up and grabbed the knife she keeps in the drawer of her bedside table. She told her sons to stay in her room and close the door, and only open it if she came back and said their safe word, which she didn't mention what that word was, but it's neither here nor there. Trinette then crept through her house, the upper unit of a duplex, turning on lights as she went, and was able to make sure no one was in her home. What she did find, however, was a trail of black dust, leading from the closet in her kids' room up to her front door, which she said was now unlocked. She mentioned that she doesn't trust her downstairs neighbors, so she never, ever leaves her door unlocked. She opened the door, and the trail continued into the stairwell and stopped just underneath the opening to the attic. Juror number 9, Lysandra Morales. Lysandra was cooking dinner for her husband, waiting for him to get home from work, when the entire kitchen, which was sweltering due to both the oven and the stovetop producing heat, went cold. She said it happened in a split second. At first, she thought she just had the chills, but they didn't go away. Then, she heard a sliding noise in her hallway, heading away from her. She said she froze in fear for a moment, then grabbed the largest knife she had in her kitchen and peeked around the corner. Something draped in black was on the floor of her hallway, sliding down the hall. She began tearing up when she said that it was trailed by the black dust, and that it stopped underneath her attic. She quickly ran to her living room to call the police, and by the time she looked again, the thing was gone, with no trail past below the attic entrance. The police showed up, looked around her house and in her attic, and found nothing. There was another account that was just more of the same. Obviously, the common themes here are the something black lurking around, the attics of homes, and the black dust. Everyone is pretty scared, naturally. One of them said that the police, detectives, and medical workers will be on the stand tomorrow, so hopefully we can get some answers as to what the black dust is and what was found at John Willis's house the night of the murders. I'll report back after court tomorrow with what I find out, and with anything more that might happen tonight, although I truly hope nothing does. Talk to everyone soon. Part 3. Yesterday after court, I immediately went home and wrote down everything that had happened since my previous post. I think it's best if I keep everyone up to date, just in case something happens. At least people will know what's going on and give me the best advice possible. I also want to say I appreciate the help offered by those of you who have in fact offered. Sadly, I had to put up the disclaimer at the top of the post because I was getting a rash of inbox messages from people claiming I'd go into jail soon. Anyways, back to what you guys really care about. As I said, I came home, I posted yesterday's update, and not long after that, I got a call from Lysandra. The affected jurors all exchanged numbers. She said that on her ride home, she was followed by something. It wasn't another car or person, but rather, she said, something that was always just out of her peripheral vision. Like she would see it out of the corner of her eye, and when she looked, it was gone. She said she got back to her house, where she had her husband screw close the door to the attic and sat down in her living room. When the thing returned at the sides of her vision, she didn't look to it, but rather kept looking straight ahead. She said it inched its way closer to her over the course of nearly 2 whole minutes. It got nearly a foot away from her face and looked up. I'll give you her words verbatim, because they're going to stick with me for the rest of my, hopefully long and peaceful, life. She said, "It was the face of pure evil. It was rage, hate, and malice incarnate." According to Lysandra, it had holes where its eyes should have been, and rotting skin that was falling off its face as if it had been flayed with a cheese grater. It had teeth that seemed to go on for rows down the back of its throat, not sharpened, but broken, like if you snapped a stick and it wound up with multiple points. During the time it was getting closer to her, dread consumed her. When she couldn't take it anymore, she looked towards it and it was gone. I decided to take the advice of several Redditors and resolved to stay at a hotel for the night. I packed up a small bag and stepped out my front door. As I was locking it, I heard something slide around inside. I walked over to my window and peeked my head around to see inside my house. There was black dust everywhere. It hadn't been there when I was in the house just seconds prior, but it was all over my living room. The television, the part of the dining room table that I could see was covered in it, and the floor in the hallway had it all over the floor and walls, even the ceiling. I got in my car and got the hell out of there. The nightmare. At the hotel, I was actually okay. Nothing directly happened to me, but I did have the most vivid, terrifying nightmare I've ever had. In the nightmare, I'm at my house and I go to the attic. I feel that I don't want to go, but something is compelling me to do it anyways. I walk below the door and look up, and I can hear breathing coming from up above. I reach up and let the stairs down, and black dust falls off as it lowers. I look up into the darkness of my attic, and I see 2 spots that are darker than the rest of the area, if that makes sense. I stare deeply into these 2 small, endless pits of black, and begin to ascend the stairs. Suddenly, something grabs me from behind, and I'm swung like a horizontal pendulum from the stairs to the hallway wall, which has had all of its slats broken. I'm impaled, but I live. Then, something I can't see takes me off of the wall and begins breaking all of my bones individually, eventually stuffing me inside a small suitcase. Then I hear the words, "Go up," and I jolted awake. Now, we all know what the dream was. It was a recreation of the murder I'm on the jury for. I'm also pretty sure I can discern what "go up" means. Probably means go to the attic. Like a dumbass. No thank you. I got up to go to court this morning, and on my way out I was walking down the hall and I noticed a small pile of the black dust in front of a utility closet. I didn't stop to find out why it was there. Trinette and Lysandra went to the judge this morning and told him about what's been happening to us. They said that the judge brushed it off, saying the connection of the black dust was thin at best, but that we could talk more after the day was over. Let me get to the court stuff. They had the lead detective testify, as well as the officers that first arrived on the scene and the medical examiner, then finally, John Willis himself. Detective Alan Potts. Detective Potts was assigned the murder and testified that he couldn't see what other explanation there was for the murders besides John Willis himself. Coupling the fact that his wife was cheating on him and his sister delivered potentially upsetting news, there was motive and opportunity. He said it seemed like a crime of passion, aside from the broken slats in the hallway. They had no way of proving when that was done. There were 2 things that didn't make sense to him, though. One was the black powder that was present at the scene. The other was the fact that John is a small, meek man. He doesn't look as if he would be capable of breaking all of his wife's bones so precisely so as to fold her and put her into a suitcase. Nor did he outwardly have the medical know-how. That being said though, looks can be deceiving, and we can't know beyond a doubt that he didn't in fact possess that knowledge. Along those same lines, it doesn't seem as if he'd have been able to lift his sister up 2 feet and impale her. He said that despite these inconsistencies, he firmly believes that John Willis is guilty of the murder. Officer Joanna Presley. Officer Presley and her partner, Nathaniel Danwright, were the officers who responded to John Willis's 911 call. She reported that they arrived to the scene and saw John sitting on his front porch with blood all over him. Not absolutely covered in blood, but a substantial amount. He seemed extremely distressed, and his demeanor did not match that of someone who just carried out a double murder. He refused to go back inside, and kept telling them not to go near the attic, over and over. He said, quote, "It's watching him, and it got what it wanted, multiple times as well." In his initial statement, he claimed that it came down from the attic, just like I knew it was going to. It broke my wall all at one time and slammed my sister on it. Then it took its cape and swarmed to my wife, and when it got up, she was a pile of a human being. There was a suitcase out already, so it slid over and put her inside it and closed it. He recanted his statement about his wife later on, stating that he didn't see what happened to her, which is why he didn't report that she was in the suitcase, leaving police to find her themselves. Sketchy, I know. Chief Medical Examiner Glenn Loof. Glenn Loof did the autopsies on the bodies. Despite their appearances, the victims did not die how you'd think they did. They were both suffocated. This means that Erica was alive for a time while stuck on the wall, and Jessica was alive entirely during the process of having all of her bones broken. The black powder recovered at the scene was also in both victims' lungs, and the rest of their primary organs showed signs of burning, something he'd never seen outside of a death caused by fire. The black dust was tested, and no match could be made. It has no earthly qualities. It is absolutely not anything the scientists assigned to the case had ever seen before in their long careers, so we're not any closer on that. And finally, the only person who really knows what happened, John Willis himself. Testimony of defendant John Willis. John started his testimony by telling us he was not crazy. He insisted that what he was about to say was the God's honest truth. For about 2 months before the murders, he was experiencing weird things in his house. It would be unseasonably cold in his house at strange times, things would move around his house, he kept finding black dust everywhere, and he became convinced that someone was living in his attic. He tried getting help from a paranormal investigator, but couldn't get one out to him in time to look into it. He said a creature came to him in his dreams and told him he wanted him, that was all he wanted, because he was special. He couldn't just take him. He could offer himself, or it would take someone he loved. He said he never offered himself, and that's why it took his wife. He figured it took his sister as it was opportunistic. She was never a target. He said his wife was planning on leaving that night, as they had had a big fight about her ongoing relationship with another man, and had taken a suitcase out of the attic, and almost tripped on her way down, letting out a yelp. He claimed he was sitting in the living room at the time, talking to his sister about his issue with Jessica, when Erica got up to go see what happened. John followed, and that's when it all happened. The thing came down from the attic. As it lowered, the drywall tore off the slats and they folded down while breaking at the top. It turned around and basically stretched out an arm and swung, lifting Erica off the ground and into the impromptu spikes. Then it turned to Jessica and enveloped her in its cape. It stood there for about 10 seconds, then let her go, and she was just a pile of skin and broken bones. It then slid the suitcase over, opened it, placed Jessica neatly inside, and zipped it almost all the way shut. It then retreated back into the attic. He said he loved his wife no matter what, and hadn't been told the news from his sister yet, so he had absolutely no reason to harm either of them. Court was adjourned until tomorrow, where we will hear closing arguments and start our deliberation. The affected jurors got together and went to the judge, then went to the court cafe and talked. The judge said he was going to think about all of the information we presented to him and speak to us in the morning. So now we have to get to court even earlier. As I said, we then went to the court cafe and had a conversation. It turns out, we had all had the exact same dream. All 6 of us dreamed the exact same thing. We all wondered why we're having these things happen to us and the rest aren't, and it turns out that I got off pretty easy last night. Trinette said her sons opened up the attic hatch in their apartment because they heard an animal up there, and when they did, a bright light filled the hallway, and it got down to about 40 degrees in their house until she closed it. Mike had entered his house and seen something crawling through his living room, leaving a trail of dust behind it. Mike said he gave chase to it, but after it turned a corner, he couldn't find it. Later in the evening, he vomited a black sludge. One of the jurors I haven't named yet, Marcus Hightower, said he pulled into his driveway and saw a face in his upstairs bedroom window, and that it was, quote, the most evil thing he had ever laid eyes on. He felt its hate for him and everything else in the world. All 3 of those jurors and their families spent the nights in hotels last night. Tonight is the last night before the end of this trial. I have no reason to believe that whatever this thing is will not step up its game tonight, and I have a theory about what's going on. I'll reveal my theory tomorrow, mostly because I don't want to sound stupid. Part 4. The last night before the jury deliberation brought forth only one thing: a terrible nightmare. All of us jurors are sitting around a table discussing aspects of the case, most notably the inconsistencies in the defense. It seemed like a relative slam dunk. The affected jurors seemed fine and didn't bring up the oddities that have been plaguing us. Then, something atop the drop ceiling scurried around. We all look up as black dust drops down onto the table. There is a knock on the door. The bailiff opens it from the outside, and in walks Anthony Mineo, the lover of the late Jessica Willis. He does a lap around the table as we sit silently. He then drops to his knees and chants something I can't remember. The whole ceiling above the table falls, seemingly from the mountain of black dust resting on it. From the dust comes the form of the entity that has been plaguing us for the last week. It gets bigger than I could have imagined, and takes one whole side of the table, both affected jurors and non-affected jurors, and envelops them in his cape. When he retracts his arm, the revelation is gruesome. All the people that were covered by the cloak, or cape, whatever it was, are basically sitting piles of skin and organs, their bones just gone. The entity jumps off the table and grabs the person who was trying to get the door open to run, but having no luck in opening it. It then balls up the woman like a piece of paper, blood getting everywhere, and tosses her to the side like nothing. The rest of the jurors, besides myself, suddenly spontaneously combust. They run around screaming, but no smoke is coming from them. Only more of that black dust falls where their skin should. The thing then jumps back on the table and crawls towards me. I'm sitting at the end of the table in shock. It inches its way towards me, and I finally see its face, and it's exactly like Lysandra described. Pure evil, hate, rage, all the negative emotions wrapped up into one horribly twisted face. It lunges at me, and I wake up. It was easily the most vivid nightmare I've ever had. I called Lysandra, who coincidentally had had the same dream at the same time, and as we would soon find out, all of us affected did. All of this had something to do with Anthony Mineo. Myself and the rest of the affected jurors met at a 24-hour diner near the courthouse shortly after. It was around 4 a.m., and we talked until court that day. It turns out, Trinette had foregone her outwardly displayed sanity and asked the other jurors if they had attics, to which most responded yes. So we still don't know why we were chosen instead of the rest of them. It was time for court, and we walked into the courtroom, the 6 of us wary about what might potentially happen. Both sides made their closing arguments. The defense basically threw his away and just begged us to find John Willis not guilty. He looked so disheveled. Surely someone in the building had asked him if he were hungover. His eyes were baggy, and I noticed black on his fingertips and palms. He looked worse than we did. It was finally time for our deliberation. None of the affected jurors sat at the end of the table. Of course, 6 of us held out, while the other 6 immediately said guilty. Then began the long explanation of what had been happening to us, and why this weird lady was inquiring about all of their house's attic space. They looked at us like we were crazy, and rightfully so. We sat in the room for hours, trying to convince them that something else was going on, and to look past the obvious pitfalls in the defense. We said that whatever this was affecting the defense attorney too. It came time to go outside and tell the judge that we hadn't yet reached a conclusion. We all walked out, and I saw the defense attorney open his briefcase. When we delivered the news that we hadn't yet agreed on a verdict, the defense attorney took a revolver out of his briefcase and handed it to John Willis, who promptly put it in his mouth and pulled the trigger. The defense attorney followed suit, killing himself as well. There was an unmistakably inhuman shriek that followed. We barely had time to react before we were rushed out of the courtroom and placed in a staging area outside the building. We were there for what seemed like hours, but was in reality only a few minutes. We were recused from our jury duty, and informed that the police would arrive soon to get our statements, which they did. Everyone told what they saw, and we were released. I returned to my hotel room, hoping that the ordeal was all over. I couldn't have been more wrong. I opened the door to the room, and it was covered, absolutely covered from floor to ceiling, wall to wall, with black dust. Naturally, I went in the room and investigated. Just kidding. I ran out of there like I had stole something. Doing what I should have done immediately after being released, I regrouped with Marcus, another of the affected jurors, and we decided to see what was up with Anthony Mineo, since he had appeared in all of our dreams. He lived just outside town on a small farmland property, and as soon as we got there, neither of us felt welcome. There were strange things hanging from his trees, sticks that made weird shapes, hay bales in certain patterns that I can't rightfully describe. We walked up to his door and knocked. He opened his door, revealing himself to be dressed in a hooded robe with black makeup painted on his face in different shapes and patterns. Before we even got a chance to say anything, he spoke. He lives above, and he takes below. Hello to you too, Mr. Mineo. We asked him what has been happening to us and why. What happened to John's family, and why John and his attorney killed themselves. Surprisingly, he answered our questions relatively straightforwardly. What happened to John and his family? Anthony became fed up after his 2-year affair with John's wife. Years earlier, he had lived in New Orleans and became a practitioner of hoodoo. He decided to get rid of John by using a certain spell to conjure an entity that would kill him, only the plan backfired. The entity became infatuated with John and wanted nothing more than to consume him and make him his own. Apparently, John refused to give in to the entity, and as a punishment, it killed his wife and sister. Why we've been affected and not the other jurors. According to Anthony, this entity feeds on belief. It's relatively simple, actually. The more someone believes in and fears the entity, which does indeed have a name, I just can't for the life of me pronounce it, let alone spell it, the more powerful it becomes. It wears down people's faculties, drives them nearly insane, then takes their mind and soul back to hell with him, where they apparently live as his eternal slaves. The reason we were affected is because it saw victims in us. We were near enough to John that it observed us and knew it could take us. The reason the other jurors weren't affected was simply that they don't believe in the supernatural or paranormal. I thought I didn't believe in this stuff either, but apparently I do. Apparently I do enough to the point that I've been giving this thing power. It can be many places at once, and it always takes up shelter in the areas above someone. If someone doesn't have an attic, he'd stay in the rafters underneath the roof of the home. If you lived in an apartment complex underneath someone else, it would stay hidden in the upper area units, leaving no trace besides a trail of black dust. Simply put, the more you give into it, the more powerful it becomes. Why John and his attorney committed suicide. Anthony's answer for this was also pretty straightforward. They killed themselves because they realized they would never stop being taunted by this entity, and took the only way out they knew. And I mean, as morbid as it is, that makes pretty good sense if you ask me. What we can do. Of course, we asked Anthony how we could end this curse. He gave us a list of instructions and some different spices, salts, and plants with directions on how to use them. Kindly enough, he gave us enough to distribute to the rest of the jurors, all while apologizing to us profusely, saying he never meant for anyone else to get hurt because of this. He said we must follow his instructions to the letter, or we would lose the battle and be taken down to hell with the entity. No pressure. We left Anthony's and regaled the information and distributed the items amongst the rest of the jurors, and we all went our separate ways, getting rid of the entity once and for all. I followed Anthony's instructions as closely as I possibly could. First, I had to go back home and put the salts and spices around the entrances and exits to my house, doors, windows, etc. Not to keep the entity out, but to keep him in, because he's already there. He apparently preys on you when you're tired, and according to Anthony, can only take someone to hell at precisely 10:28 p.m. Don't ask me, I'm not the magic entity bringer upper guy. Then, I took a bunch of the herbs Anthony gave me and crushed them up as best I could. I put them in a circle in my living room, and then took a bunch of the black dust I'd been finding everywhere from a bag of it Anthony gave me, and covered the crushed up herbs in an effort to disguise it. The reasoning for this is that when the entity travels back to hell, it does so through a portal made from its dust. I would agree to join him in hell, and when we would enter the portal, he would be trapped within the circle of herbs, which he cannot cross back from. Anthony explained that he can willingly cross into them, but not out. Then I waited until 10:20 p.m. At that time, I began calling out for the entity, saying I'd given up and wished to join him in hell. It took until 10:24 for me to hear the attic stairs fall down, and then to hear the entity slide his way down the hall. It reached my living room and stood up in front of me, and I'm not gonna lie, I peed my pants a little bit. I'd never gotten a look at this thing from the front before. Its body underneath the cloak was hard and scaly, a dark green color to its cracking skin. I've already described its face. It stood nearly 7 feet tall, having to duck under the banister into my living room. I again stated I'd given up and wished to join him into hell if he would only lead the way. It walked up to me and I stood my ground. It loomed over me, as intimidating as something could ever possibly be, and breathed down hot, putrid breath on my face. I nearly vomited when I inhaled it. Black dust fell from its shoulders onto me. I claimed I constructed a portal for it, and again, that I wished to join it in hell for an eternity if it would just lead the way. It stared at me for a few moments, then turned to the circle I'd made. It apprehensively went toward the circle, inspecting it, looking back at me to see what I was doing every few seconds. Eventually, it stood just outside the circle and presented an arm, welcoming me into it. Thinking quickly, I replied, "I am your servant. I never walked before you." It stood for a moment, let out a scoff, and entered the circle. I quickly turned around and lifted up my couch cushion, retrieving the papers Anthony had given me with the things I needed to say to banish the thing from my home forever. And so, I did my best recitation of that text. As I finished reading it, I suddenly heard the same screech I'd heard in the courtroom earlier in the day, and the floor within the circle burst into flames. The entity then stared at me with its lack of eyes and slowly dropped into the flames. Once it was completely submerged, the flame cut out, and all that was left was a black pile of dust. Needless to say, I couldn't believe it. Anthony told me that the spell only works in my home, so if I were to move, I would need to do a protection spell against it in my next residence, as I will now forever be a target of it. If that's the case, I'm never moving. Pretty simple. I called the others, but only got 2 responses so far. Marcus and Lysandra both reported that their spells had gone identically to mine, and they both said they felt safer already. I don't know what happened to the rest of the affected jurors, but I do hope they went the same way. I'll update if and when I hear from or about them. I don't know if this was the resolution you were looking for or hoping for, but it's the resolution of what's been happening to me. I don't know if I feel safe just yet. I guess time will tell. Thank you for all of your support and advice throughout this ordeal. I know myself and the rest of the jurors have benefited from your kind words and tips through battling this thing that we were just unfortunate enough to have become haunted by. I thank you all again, and please get in touch with me if you have any questions. I'm gonna go wait to hear from the other 3 jurors.